Welcome to Take 10 with Pastor Don. I'm Don McGarvey, pastor of the Troy Mills Christian Church in Troy Mills, Iowa. This non-denominational podcast is designed to help you see God in a more personal way. The past couple of times together, we focused on the topic of opposition as it was written about in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah gives us 3 examples of opposition that he faced as he was rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. I find it interesting that if you read the first couple of chapters of Nehemiah, you will discover how Nehemiah obtained permission from the king to return to his home, Jerusalem, and rebuild the walls. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes. Being a cupbearer placed Nehemiah in a high-ranking position in the king's court. He served the king his wine and made sure there was no danger to the king from what he ate or drank. But usually the cupbearer was also a high-level confidant and advisor of the king. In Nehemiah chapter 2, it seems to indicate that the king had great confidence and respect for Nehemiah and was completely supportive of the project when Nehemiah asked for permission to travel back to Jerusalem. I mention this as some background information because sometimes when things start off really well, we tend to drop our guard against any type of opposition. But when opposition arises, and it will, we get caught off guard sometimes. In the book of Nehemiah, opposition came from 3 sources. In chapter 4, opposition came from outsiders. There were Samaritans, there were Arabs, and there were Ammonites who rose up against Nehemiah and the Jews who had traveled back with him, and they didn't want Jerusalem rebuilt. They made life miserable for the Jews. They ridiculed them, they pestered them, they threatened them. And I love Nehemiah's response, and it needs to become our response. Nehemiah's response to this opposition was to keep working. He didn't stop. He stayed alert, and he was prepared for anything that might come along. Some of the workers worked with one hand and kept a weapon in the other hand. Nehemiah kept the trumpeter who would sound the alarm with him at all times. As a matter of fact, some of the crew, the scriptures say, and I don't understand everything about this, but the scriptures say that when they retired for the night, they stayed in their work clothes just in case they had to jump up and defend themselves on the spur of the moment. The next wave of opposition in chapter 5 came from within the ranks of the Jews. It would be safe to say that selfishness and greed rose in the heart of some, and they took advantage of some who were going through tough times. What I love about the example that God gives us through the life of Nehemiah is that Nehemiah was very aggressive in dealing with his opposition. The scripture says that he became angry because the opposition rose up, but he didn't sin in his anger. He didn't take it out on those who were being selfish and greedy. In other words, what he did was that he appealed to their love for one another. He appealed to their humanitarian side. And he appealed to their desire to make God known. He asked them, he says, what are our enemies going to think when they see us taking advantage of one another? And is treating one another, he asked, is treating one another in this way a good example and a good testimony of God's love? Well, he challenged those Jews who were taking advantage of others about living in the fear of the Lord, in respect of the Lord. How was taking advantage of your fellow Jews bringing honor to God's name? Someone noticed that based upon the math in Nehemiah chapter 5 and verse 11, that the interest being charged to the people who had taken out loans was 12%. God instructed the Jews to not charge interest when they were helping one another. And so what they did was they repaid the interest, and they agreed to stop taking advantage of one another, and they continued on with the rebuilding of the wall. So the first wave of opposition came from outside the ranks. The second wave of opposition came from within the ranks of the Jews, and they overcame both of those things. But the opposition didn't stop. This time in chapter 6, instead of the opposition coming from outsiders or from within the ranks of the Jews, the opposition took on a very personal approach towards Nehemiah. The leaders of the opposition from the outside attempted to lure Nehemiah away to a place called Ono, O-N-O. It was about 15 to 20 miles away from Jerusalem, a day's travel. And the assumption was that when Nehemiah got there, isolated from the rest of the Jews, they would kill him. I love what Nehemiah, how he responded to this invitation to go to the plain of Ono. He said, "Oh no, I can't do that. Oh no to Ono." And they tried this ploy 4 different times. They invited Nehemiah to come to the plain of Ono to meet. And every time Nehemiah said no. The 5th time they tried to blackmail Nehemiah by sending along a letter that would be sent to the Persian king with a fabricated story about how Nehemiah was plotting to rebel against the king and to establish Jerusalem as a rival kingdom. When this didn't work, they tried another ploy. Sanballat, who was a Samaritan, along with Tobiah, who was an Arab, hired some of the prophets to lure Nehemiah into the temple. Now, on the outside, for just a casual reading, that doesn't sound too bad. But the place in the temple they wanted to meet was a place that only 2 people were allowed. One was the priest, and Nehemiah wasn't a priest. And the second one was a place of safety for someone who had accidentally murdered someone and killed someone. It was their safe haven to go to. And Nehemiah hadn't accidentally killed anyone. But the prophets tried to lure him in. And Nehemiah didn't drop his guard. He says, "I have no business going into the temple." And he remained true to what the law said. He remained integral in his dealings with the temple. And so Nehemiah was alert to the schemes of the enemy, and he realized what was happening. And once again, he said, "No, I don't have to do this." Now, at this point, after he finally says no, we read in chapter 6 how that the wall was completed in 52 days. Now, again, for most of us, we don't understand how miraculous that was. For a group of people who were not stonemasons under any set of circumstances, to have come and dealt with the opposition that they had to deal with, and they rebuilt the wall. And oh, by the way, the wall was 40 to 50 feet high. It wasn't just a little wall up to the waist or up to your knees. It was 40 to 50 feet high, and it was several feet thick. Matter of fact, later on in Nehemiah, people walk up to the wall, and one choir goes one way and another choir goes another way, and they have this great praise service thanking God for his help in helping them to rebuild the wall. So the wall was 40 to 50 feet high, several feet thick, and it ran for 1.5 to 2 miles around the city. Now, Nehemiah provides us with 3 notable examples of how to deal with opposition. Number 1 is that we need to stay focused on what God has called us to do. Stay alert for attacks from the enemy. Don't drop your guard. No matter how good things seem to be going, we have an enemy. The Bible tells us, and Nehemiah's enemy really wasn't Sanballat or Tobiah or any of the outsiders. Nehemiah's enemy wasn't even the Jews who took advantage of one another for a while. Nehemiah's enemy was Satan, just like your enemy and my enemy is Satan. And he has schemes. The Apostle Paul wrote about how that we need to be aware of the schemes of our enemy because he's trying to swindle us or to outwit us from the things of God. And so Nehemiah showed us the importance of staying alert no matter what we're doing, and be prepared because the enemy will attack. We need to make sure that we also, according to what Nehemiah showed us, how that we treat one another as God has instructed us. Our projects are not licensed for us to use or abuse those that God has placed along our side. Remember, how we treat one another is a testimony of our love and our respect for God. And finally, we need to make sure that we don't drop our guard and fall prey to the things that might look okay, such as a meeting in or a meeting in the temple, but both were places that Nehemiah had no business being. And so when opposition comes along, and it will come along, we need to stay focused. We need to stay true to what God has called us to and not allow ourselves to be tempted to stray from God's plan. Well, that's it for our Take 10 with Pastor Don today. We would love for you to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Please hit the subscribe button, and thank you for doing so. We'll be back next Wednesday. Hope and pray that you have a wonderful week. God bless you.